Welcome back. Today, we've prepared a very specific journey just for you, pulling together this fascinating stack of your historical sources into one cohesive story.
Yeah, it's an incredible set of documents to go through.
It really is. So
Yeah.
we are taking a deep dive into 19th century Qajar Iran. And our mission today is to figure out how this specific empire managed what is honestly an unbelievable tightrope act.
Right, because they somehow survived the aggressive, world-swallowing imperial expansions of both Russia and Britain.
Exactly. And they did it without becoming a formal colony, which is a wild feat when you look at, what was happening to the rest of the non-Western world at the time.
Absolutely. But, as the documents show, they paid a massive, transformative internal price to pull it off.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are at the dawn of the 1800s. And the geopolitical reality is that Iran finds itself squeezed squarely between two expanding behemoths.
Right, you've got the Russian Empire relentlessly pushing down from the Caucasus in the north.
And British India is creeping up from the south and east. So, almost overnight, Iran is forced into becoming the classic buffer state.
Yeah, and as I pull up this map of 19th century Eurasia behind me, what's fascinating here is the sheer paradox of this situation.
How so?
Well, if you scan across to India or look down toward Egypt or examine other non-Western regions during this exact same era, they are actively succumbing to colonial rule.
Right, their borders are just being erased or redrawn by London and Paris.
Exactly. But Iran manages to preserve its physical borders as a sovereign entity. The catch, though, is that survival was largely cartographic.
Meaning on the map, Iran survived.
Right, on the map. But inside those borders, the economy, the social fabric, and, well, the very identity of the people were radically fractured by the sheer crushing pressure of just trying to hold that map together.
And the mechanism they used to hold it together in the beginning, it isn't military might. It's pure theater.
Oh, 100% theater.
The Qajar dynasty realized very quickly that they didn't have the military logistics or the economic muscle to actually fight off modern European empires on an open battlefield.
So to compensate, they had to project this aura of untouchable ancient majesty.
Let's look at Fath Ali Shah, who comes to power right around this time. His predecessor, his uncle Aka Muhammad Khan, was this castrated, battle-hardened, tribal tent dweller who literally cemented his palace with the blood and bones of his rivals.
Yeah, he was a completely utilitarian ruler, just a slight-framed warrior who spent his entire life in the saddle.
He cared absolutely nothing for courtly aesthetics or luxury.
Right, which makes Fath Ali Shah's pivot so stark.
It's incredible. Fath Ali Shah's strategy is essentially fake it till you make it, but on a geopolitical scale.
Exactly. He completely abandons that austere warrior aesthetic.
He intentionally grows this massive, bushy, floor-length black beard. He constructs the glaring sun throne, which, later becomes famous as the peacock throne.
And he tops himself with a towering, jewel-encrusted Kyanid crown.
It's all about aggressively projecting hyper-virility and endless resources. I mean, he takes so many wives and concubines that he produces over 100 children.
Which is just staggering. And by the 1860s, that single bloodline results in a sprawling political network of some 10,000 Qajar princes.
10,000? That is wild.
It is, but we have to look at the mechanics of why that illusion was so necessary. In the early 19th century, before the telegraph or the camera, European empires relied entirely on the handwritten reports of their emissaries.
Because diplomatic communication was incredibly slow.
Exactly. So if a British or Russian envoy travels to Tehran and writes back to his capital describing a Shah sitting on a mountain of diamonds, commanding tens of thousands of heirs, it creates a formidable paper trail.
It manufactures an image of absolute, unassailable stability.
Right, an image that makes foreign capitals hesitate before launching an invasion. It was a very conscious diplomatic defense mechanism.
And they push that defense mechanism to absurd lengths during face-to-face encounters. The sources detail an 1800 meeting with the British envoy John Malcolm, who was representing the East India Company.
Oh, the protocol battles in that meeting were intense.
Yeah, the Qajars are so desperate to assert absolute equality with the British crown that the entire negotiation gets bogged down in wild disputes over etiquette.
Right, because Malcolm brought an absolute fortune in jewels, mirrors, and scientific instruments to purchase a political alliance.
But Fath Ali Shah's court orchestrates the encounter so that these aren't received as diplomatic gifts between equals.
No, not at all. They are framed entirely as tribute being offered to the Shah's imperial might.
They even forced the British delegation to wrap their military boots in makeshift cloth covers to respect Persian indoor customs.
But then they absolutely deny them permission to even sit down in the Shah's presence.
Which is just hilarious.
Yeah.
But, geopolitical theater has a fatal flaw. You can only fake it for so long before someone calls your bluff.
Right. You can make the British wear cloth booties and stand in the corner, but when actual war breaks out with a modernized power like Russia, the glittering facade completely shatters.
And that clash was devastating.
Truly devastating. In 2 brutal rounds of war, the traditional Qajar methods of irregular tribal cavalry were utterly decimated by Russian artillery and disciplined infantry.
The result is the Treaties of Golestan in 1813 and Torkamanchay in 1828.
Right.
Iran loses massive prized territories in the Caucasus.
Yeah, the areas that make up modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and this wasn't just a blow to their pride.
No, this was territory highly valued for its rich agriculture and lucrative silk production.
Exactly. And the financial penalty attached to those treaties is staggering.
The Qajars are forced to pay a crippling war indemnity to Russia of 5 million tumans in gold.
To put that in perspective for you, that sum was nearly twice the size of the Iranian state's entire annual income at the time.
Wow, twice the annual income.
Yeah. And the humiliation was intensely, physically visceral. The gold wasn't just transferred on paper.
Oh, right. It was physically weighed out on giant scale in front of victorious Russian officers before being shipped north to St. Petersburg.
And to find that gold, the Qajar state had to squeeze its remaining provinces dry with aggressive extra taxation.
Which pushed the entire country to the brink of absolute bankruptcy, which brings us to a massive structural pivot point in this history.
Yeah, the power vacuum.
Exactly. The Qajar state just proved to everyone, unequivocally, that it could not protect its borders and it could not protect its economy.
Right. And when a state fails that spectacularly, a power vacuum naturally opens up.
The public naturally turns to a different authority for structure, meaning, and protection. And in 19th-century Iran, that authority becomes the Shii clerical establishment.
Right. We see the rapid rise and institutionalization of the Usuli school of Shii jurisprudence.
Which is very different from what came before.
Very. The Usulis established a very strict, vertical legal theory. They argued that everyday believers were fundamentally incapable of interpreting complex religious law on their own.
So they needed a guide?
Exactly. Therefore, they had to practice taqlid, or emulation. Every single believer was required to choose a living expert jurist, a mujtahid, and explicitly follow their rulings in all matters of life.
And the documentation of these rulings is just mind-boggling. The definitive text of this era is the Jawahir al-Kalam by Najafi. It is a massive 44-volume compendium.
It's huge.
But reading through the sources, the breakdown of those volumes is what really stands out. I mean, it barely touches on public law or state boundaries or international diplomacy.
Right, because nearly half of its thousands of pages are devoted to purity rituals.
It details meticulous, almost fetishistic rules about scatological cleansing, bodily fluids, how to wash, what materials to touch,
and strict protocols for avoiding any polluting physical contact with infidels.
While it seems deeply obsessive to a modern reader, we have to look at the mechanism of power here.
Right, because when the central state is crumbling and bankrupt, controlling public civil law or international borders is impossible for the clerics.
But controlling individual, ritualistic behavior.
That is a sphere where they could exert absolute dominance. And they enforced this without a state police force. They used the threat of social death.
Social death?
Wow. If a mujtahid declared a merchant impure because he violated a washing ritual, that merchant was economically dead. No one would buy from him. No one would marry his children.
So by regulating the absolute minutiae of everyday physical existence, the Usuli clerics created a comprehensive local social order that the humiliated Qajar state simply could not provide.
Exactly.
Let me push back on the mechanics of that, though. The Qajar state just watches this happen. They allow a parallel justice system to rise up and govern the daily lives of their citizens just because they lost a war.
Well, the Qajars lacked a sacred lineage. They weren't descended from the prophet or the imams, so they desperately needed the cleric's blessing to maintain any shred of legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
I see.
So Pahlavi Shah actively appeased them, showering them with tax exemptions and land grants to keep the peace.
Which turns the clerical network into something resembling a medieval megacorporation.
Right.
I mean, look at figures like the cleric Shafti in Isfahan.
Right. He is a perfect example.
He wasn't just a spiritual guy giving sermons. He was a titan of local industry. The sources note he owned 40 caravansaries, 1,000 shops, and vast agricultural estates.
He essentially ran his own private fiefdom, enforcing his own brutal laws.
Yeah, he ordered lashings, smashed wine cellars, and personally carried out executions, including public beheadings.
And this was entirely outside the state's judicial system.
It perfectly illustrates the total vacuum of state authority. You have a central government that is bankrupt and humiliated on the world stage,
Coexisting with an intensely rigid, incredibly wealthy clerical class operating with total impunity.
And to understand the breaking point of this society, we really have to look at the economic reality for the average person on the street.
Because it wasn't good.
No, because while the clerics are hoarding wealth and obsessing over purity, the broader economy is in absolute freefall.
Driven directly by those foreign treaties.
Yes, the treaties with Russia, and subsequently with Britain, forced Iran to accept a flat 5% tariff on imported European goods.
Which means the Qajars signed away their right to protect their own industries.
Suddenly, massive volumes of cheap, machine-made British Manchester chintz and calico fabrics just flood the Iranian market.
And local Persian weavers using manual looms simply cannot compete with British industrialization.
In the city of Tishan alone, the number of active silk looms plummets from 8,000 to just 800.
Entire merchant classes are wiped out.
And then you combine that economic ruin with expanding global trade routes that repeatedly bring devastating cholera pandemics into the cities.
Wiping out tens of thousands of people in a matter of weeks.
So put yourself in the shoes of an average Iranian in the 1840s. Your national pride has been shattered by foreign empires. Your local livelihood is destroyed by cheap British imports.
Your neighbors are dying in the streets from cholera.
The government in Tehran is broke and powerless, and the local wealthy clerics are obsessing over the exact physical mechanics of how you wash your hands.
You are living in an absolute pressure cooker of a society.
The people are starved, they're terrified, and they are completely alienated from their leadership. And that immense pressure directly triggers a massive, radical explosion from below.
Right. Out of this profound systemic despair emerges a grassroots messianic movement.
A movement that attempts to completely overwrite the corrupted system they are trapped in. The Babi movement.
Exactly. It begins with Sayyid Ali Muhammad, a young, charismatic merchant from Shiraz who becomes known as the Bab, or the Gateway.
And initially, his claim is somewhat traditional within Shia's mysticism, right?
Right. He claims to be the gateway to the hidden imam. But as his following grows, his claims radically escalate.
He declares himself the long-awaited Mahdi.
And eventually, an entirely new prophet bringing a new divine revelation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Bab isn't just proposing a religious reform. He is attempting a total operating system reboot for society.
That's a great way to put it.
He doesn't want to fix the existing Islamic structure. He wants to replace it. And the proof of how complete this intended overwrite was is in his approach to the concept of time itself.
Yes, the calendar.
The Bab throws out the traditional Islamic lunar calendar completely. He creates a brand new solar calendar consisting of 19 months with 19 days each.
And the practical implications of abrogating Islamic law were just staggering for daily life.
I can imagine.
It meant followers stopped facing Mecca when they prayed. They ignored the traditional daily prayer schedules. They canceled traditional marriage contracts.
It disrupted the entire rhythm of daily economic and social life.
Completely pulling followers out of the Usuli clerical control grid. And it attracted merchants, artisans, lower-ranking clerics, and women.
Basically, people who felt utterly disenfranchised by the rigid alliance between the Qajar state and the wealthy clerics. And if we are talking about disrupting the social grid, we have to look at the gathering at Badasht in 1848.
A truly pivotal historical moment. The Babas hold a massive conference, and a female poet, scholar, and Babi leader named Tahira stands up to address the crowd.
And during her speech, she intentionally and publicly removes her facial veil.
Right.
In 1848 Iran, that is a societal earthquake.
It was a proto-feminist milestone that deeply shocked even her own radical followers. But we have to understand the mechanism of that shock.
Removing the veil wasn't merely a statement about gender equality.
No, it was the ultimate visceral symbol of the complete abrogation of the old Islamic Sharia laws. It was visual, undeniable proof presented to the crowd that the old world was officially dead and a new era had begun.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see exactly how a fragile state responds to a total systemic threat.
Yeah, the Qajar government, now under a new young ruler named Nasir al-Din Shah, realizes this grassroots rebellion is an existential danger to their survival.
And the state responds with absolute terror and overwhelming military violence.
But the Babis don't just protest, they actually take up arms to defend themselves.
They do, leading to incredibly bloody, protracted sieges like the fortress of Tabarsi.
Right, where a small, dedicated band of Babis holds off the official government army for months.
But eventually, the sheer weight of the state crushes the movement.
The government executes the Bab by firing squad in a public square in Tabriz. They hunt down the leadership, eventually capturing and assassinating Tahira by suffocating her in secret.
But surviving that near-death experience forces a stark realization upon the Qajar leadership. They look at the ashes of this rebellion and realize something important.
Relying on ancient imperial illusions doesn't work against a modernized Russia.
And relying on conservative clerics doesn't keep the population fed or happy.
Right. If the Qajar Empire is going to survive the 19th century, they absolutely must modernize the actual physical mechanics of the state.
Which brings us to a desperate pivot, the struggle for top-down modernization.
Spearheaded by a pragmatic, visionary, but ultimately doomed chief minister named Amir Kabir.
When you look at what Amir Kabir was trying to do, is he basically the equivalent of a corporate turnaround CEO?
How do you mean?
Like the guy who gets brought in to save a dying company but ends up getting fired because the first thing he does is try to cut the board of directors' bonuses.
It's an incredibly apt analogy, actually. Amir Kabir rose from a humble background. His father was a cook, and he had traveled.
So he saw what was happening outside Iran.
Exactly. He saw firsthand how the Ottoman and Russian empires were reorganizing their bureaucracies and militaries. When he becomes chief minister in 1848, he tries to drag the Qajar state into the modern era by sheer force of will.
He establishes the Dar al-Funun, a polytechnic cadet school in Tehran.
And he had to build that from the ground up, right?
Entirely. He couldn't rely on the clerics for education. He had to physically bypass the religious establishment by importing Austrian artillery experts and French medical doctors.
He forced the translation of European engineering and anatomy manuals into Persian,
creating a secular technical curriculum in the middle of a deeply traditional society.
Furthermore, he launches the first state newspaper, the Vakai-e-Tefakia.
His goal was to educate the Iranian public about world geography, new industrial technologies, and global politics.
Even reporting on the political structure of the young American Republic, he is actively trying to open their eyes to the outside world.
But, implementing all of this requires capital. To pay for Austrian engineers and printing presses, he has to balance a bankrupt state budget.
Which raises an important question. How do you practically modernize a massive, archaic system when the very people in charge of that system benefit financially from its ongoing dysfunction?
You slash their payouts, he goes after the bloated pensions.
He enforced a brutal austerity regime. He slashed the hereditary pensions of the Qajar nobility, the royal court hangers-on, and the clerics across the board.
He even reduced the young Shah's personal pocket money.
Yeah. He tried to completely eliminate the culture of bribery, the selling of offices, and the massive hidden unemployment within the bureaucracy.
Think about your own life for a second. Whether you were trying to change a toxic corporate culture at your job, revamp a local community board, or just implement a new process in an organization you care about. Well, introducing the new software or the new idea is the easy part.
Surviving the pushback from the people whose status and income depend on the old, broken system, that is the real battle.
And it's a battle Amir Kabir fundamentally loses.
His absolute refusal to play the corrupt political games of the court created a massive, unified coalition of enemies.
This coalition included the entrenched bureaucrats, the defunded clerics, and crucially, the Shah's own mother.
They systematically poison the young Shah's mind, convincing him that Amir Kabir is too popular, too ambitious, and a threat to the throne itself.
So Amir Kabir is dismissed, sent into exile, and eventually secretly murdered.
His veins opened in a bathhouse in Kashan by the very monarch he was desperately trying to protect and modernize.
His death really is the tragic culmination of this entire era. The Qajars wanted the fruits of European modernity, the disciplined armies, the medical science, the factories.
But the traditional elite categorically refused to give up the financial privileges and the absolute power required to actually build a functioning modern state.
So the reforms remained shallow, surface-level adaptations, while the core machinery of the state remained entirely archaic.
They adopted the aesthetics of modernization without adopting the structural sacrifices required to sustain it.
Which perfectly brings us back to our starting point.
Yeah.
Let's summarize this incredible 19th century tightrope walk. Qajar Iran survived.
They faked imperial glory with giant beards, diplomatic theater, and jeweled crowns.
They survived devastating, humiliating territorial and financial losses to Russia and Britain.
They endured an almost suffocating takeover by a wealthy clerical class that obsessed over physical purity while the local economy burned to the ground.
They crushed a radical messianic attempt to literally reboot their society's entire operating system.
And they dabbled in modern statecraft with Amir Kabir, just enough to keep the engines sputtering along.
Through all of that, they survived as a sovereign entity on the map. So what does this all mean for you today? As we wrap up this deep dive, there's a final provocative thought I want you to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
Our sources make it abundantly clear that Iran survived the aggressive age of imperialism by acting as a geographic buffer state between superpowers. But think about the mechanical reality of what a buffer actually is.
It's a shock absorber.
Right, it's a shock absorber. When a nation spends an entire century acting as a literal buffer, absorbing the crushing existential pressure of foreign empires from the outside, day after day, year after year, does it permanently internalize that pressure?
That's a fascinating question.
Does the trauma of being a buffer state create a deeply ingrained political culture where any internal dissent or any desire for change from its own people is forever viewed not as progress, but as a terrifying existential threat to the nation's fragile survival?
Well, when mere survival becomes the only metric for success, every attempt at evolution begins to look like a vulnerability.
Exactly. When your whole existence relies on a delicate theater production designed to keep the wolves at bay, you simply cannot afford to let anyone change the script. Keep questioning the history behind the headlines, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
So, I want you to imagine that you are standing right in front of this sprawling, just massive ancient mansion.
Okay.
And really picture this place, right? Like, half the roof is just entirely caved in. The rafters are completely exposed to the elements. The paint is peeling off the exterior walls in these giant, miserable strips.
Just a total mess.
Exactly, a total disaster. And to make matters worse, your neighbors on both sides aren't just, encroaching a little bit. They are literally picking up their fences in the dead of night and moving them into your yard.
Oh, wow.
Right, just stealing your land piece by piece. And then inside the house, the situation is even more of a nightmare. The plumbing is completely backing up, everyone in the family is violently sick, and the people who are supposedly in charge are just fighting over the last scrap of moldy food in the pantry.
It sounds completely unsalvageable.
Yeah, to any rational outside observer, you look at this house and it's condemned. It is a total unsalvageable loss. But here is the bizarre part, the thing that really defies all logic.
The foundation holds.
The foundation holds. The house never actually collapses. In fact, if you look closely enough through the broken windows, the people inside are quietly inventing entirely new ways of living. I mean, they are writing breathtaking revolutionary poetry, and they are figuring out how to survive against completely impossible odds.
It really is just the ultimate story of survival through sheer stubborn adaptation. You expect the collapse, you wait for it, but the collapse never actually comes.
Right. And that incredibly resilient mansion brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are jumping into this fascinating stack of historical material covering the Qajar dynasty of Iran.
Yeah, primarily focusing on the period from 1797 to the late 19th century.
Right. And our main goal today for you, the listener, is to unpack a massive historical paradox. Like, how on earth did Iran survive as a sovereign nation during a century that saw almost every other non-Western country on the planet get swallowed up whole by European colonial rule?
It's such a vital question.
Mm-hmm.
And to really set the stage for you, we have to look at the global map at the dawn of the 19th century.
Please do, because it's a mess.
It is. So, as Iran enters this new era, it's emerging from a brutal period of intense 18th century isolation. Just fragmentation and horrific civil war. And almost immediately, it finds itself squeezed in this geopolitical vice.
Right. They become a buffer state.
Exactly. What political scientists call a buffer state.
Yeah.
To the south and east, you have the rapidly expanding British Empire, which is absolutely obsessed with protecting its colonial crown jewel, which is India.
Naturally.
And then to the north, you have the Russian Empire, which is relentlessly and aggressively expanding its borders downward. So Iran is caught directly in the middle of these two global superpowers, acting as the primary friction point.
And here is the fascinating hook that really stands out when you dig into this material. For a lot of the 20th century, history books painted this entire Qajar era as nothing but a tragic, embarrassing age of decadent decline.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Like the traditional narrative focused almost exclusively on the lost territory, the economically weak kings, the capitulations to foreign powers. But when you look at the actual historical reality in these sources, you see something completely different.
Yeah, you see a stunning period of cultural agility.
Yes. You see massive artistic revivals. You see incredibly brave, like, proto-feminist revolutionary movements. And you see an incredible, almost desperate political survival strategy.
Exactly. When you peel back the layer of military defeats, you find a society under unimaginable pressure, right? They're trying to modernize on their own terms while simultaneously fighting off foreign domination and internal collapse. It's just a story of incredible friction.
So we're going to explore the bizarre, highly calculated royal strategies used to consolidate power. We'll look at the geopolitical tug-of-war with Europe, the rise of a massively powerful clerical class, the sheer devastation of global pandemics on the everyday population, and eventually this radical messianic movement that tried to upend the entire social order.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It really is. So let's dive right in. We have to start with the man who sets the tone for this era. Fath Ali Shah.
Right, who takes the throne in 1797.
Yeah, 1797. And the visual contrast between him and his predecessor is just jarring. It's literally night and day.
It really is a deliberate, masterfully calculated rebranding of the monarchy. Because to understand Fath Ali Shah, you have to understand the man he replaced.
His uncle.
Yes, his uncle, Aka Muhammad Khan. He was the one who violently reunified Iran to establish the Qajar dynasty. And Aka Muhammad Khan was, simply put, a ruthless warlord.
Just brutal.
Yeah, he lived his life in military tents. I mean, he famously said he raised a royal palace and cemented it with blood.
Oh, wow. That's a quote.
It is. He was known for horrific brutality.
Right.
For instance, when he conquered the city of Kerman, he ordered the blinding of thousands of its male citizens.
Thousands. Just a completely terrifying ascetic figure.
Precisely. And there is a crucial physical detail about him. He was castrated as a youth by his political enemies. So he was physically slight, he was beardless, and he visually represented the harsh, barren, bloody reality of tribal warfare. His authority was derived entirely from fear and military prowess.
Right. And then in 1797, his nephew, Fath Ali Shah, takes over, and he goes in the exact opposite direction. I mean, he doesn't just tweak the image of the monarchy, he completely overhauls it.
Oh, entirely.
The descriptions of him project this Epicurean, overwhelming majesty. He had this famously long, dark, incredibly bushy beard that reached all the way to his narrow waist. He didn't want to live in dusty military tents. He built opulent, sprawling palaces, most notably the Golestan Palace in Tehran, which was just filled with mirrors and gardens.
And we have to understand that that beard wasn't just a personal fashion choice.
Right, it was PR.
Exactly. In the context of the time, following a king who was known for being castrated and beardless, Fath Ali Shah's massive beard, his tall stature, and his incredibly colorful, heavily jeweled appearance were explicitly designed to project majestic dignity and, crucially, immense sexual potency.
Huh.
The state had just survived decades of trauma. It desperately needed to project stability, wealth, and regenerative strength, not the precarious, bloody reality of the previous decades.
And he literally had a new crown manufactured to drive this point home, didn't he?
He did, the Qajar crown.
Dripping with pearls and rubies. And he sat on the newly constructed Sun Throne, which later became known as the Peacock Throne, which was basically just a massive bed of gold and gems.
This is unbelievable opulence.
Yeah. And then he starts doing something really interesting with the landscape itself. Like, he starts commissioning these massive rock reliefs all over the country, carving images of himself hunting lions or sitting in state surrounded by his courtiers. And the wild part is he's having these carved right next to or even directly over ancient Achaemenid and Sasanian ruins.
Yes, the rock relief at Golestan in western Iran is a perfect example of this strategy. One of his sons actually had a Qajar relief carved right over a section of a highly famous, culturally revered 7th century Sasanian site.
Which is wild. Like, to our modern sensibilities, that looks like horrific archaeological vandalism. We look at that and think, how could you destroy a 1,000-year-old carving?
Right, it feels like spray painting over the Mona Lisa.
Exactly.
But their goal wasn't archaeological preservation, right? It was ideological association.
Oh.
They were physically, permanently fusing their brand new upstart dynasty with the ancient mythical past of the Persian King of Kings.
Like the pre-Islamic grandeur found in the Shahnameh, the great Persian Book of Kings.
Precisely. The Qajars were a Turkic tribe. They didn't have deep, ancient Persian roots, so they manufactured them. They wanted the Iranian public, and just as importantly, the visiting European envoys, to look at those rocks and see an unbroken, unshakable line of imperial invincibility stretching back thousands of years.
It's fascinating, but the most shocking part of Fath Ali Shah's reinvention is what the sources refer to as his procreative feat.
Oh, yes.
To prove his potency and to secure his realm, he takes hundreds of wives and concubines. I mean, we are talking about an industrial scale of reproduction here.
Truly industrial.
Women were brought into the harem from Zand, Afshar, Kurd, Lur, Georgian, Armenian, and Jewish communities. He fathers over 100 children who actually survive into adulthood. And by the 1860s, a few decades after his death, the Qajar princely class numbered around 10,000 people.
10,000. And, it is so easy for modern observers to view this strictly through a lens of mere sensual indulgence or like Orientalist tropes about the harem. But what is truly fascinating here is the underlying geopolitical utility of this procreative strategy. The Qajar dynasty, as we noted, was tribal in its origins. And tribal chiefs are notoriously whimsical in their loyalty.
Yeah, they rebel constantly when they feel the central authority is weak.
Exactly. So by breeding this massive, sprawling royal family, Fath Ali Shah was intentionally creating a biological army of loyal administrators.
Okay, let me stop you there because I really want to unpack this for the listener. So instead of fighting a constant game of whack-a-mole with rebellious warlords in all these far-flung provinces,
Right.
the Shah basically franchises his own DNA. It's like a massive corporate restructuring where you fire all the unreliable regional managers and replace every single one of them with your own kids.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it, yeah. He instituted a semi-autonomous system of princely governments across the guarded domains, which is what they called the empire.
The guarded domains, right.
He took his senior sons and made them provincial governors. His most capable son, Abbas Mirza, was sent to Tabriz to govern the critical northern province of Azerbaijan. Another son went to the south to govern Fars. Another went to the west.
Now they're everywhere.
Everywhere. And these princes were given significant latitude to run their regions, collect local taxes, even maintain their own standing armies, as long as they remained ultimately under the umbrella of the central state in Tehran and sent revenue back to the capital. It was a highly realistic, pragmatic solution to the center-periphery tension that has always plagued sprawling Iranian empires.
But wait, I mean, doesn't that just create a completely different, potentially much worse problem? Like, if you have 10,000 royal princes running around by the 1860s, aren't you just replacing tribal warlords with a massive tax-draining aristocracy of entitled kids?
Yeah.
And wouldn't they just fight each other for the throne the second the king dies?
You've hit the nail on the head regarding the long-term flaw in the system. While it solved the immediate problem of tribal rebellion in the first generation, it created chronic, deeply destabilizing succession crises in the subsequent generations.
I can imagine.
Every time a Shah died, several of his brothers or sons, who all had their own provincial armies and treasuries, would march on Tehran claiming the throne. And furthermore, supporting thousands of princes who felt they were above menial labor became a crushing financial burden on the state peasantry. So it was a brilliant short-term survival tactic that morphed into a long-term parasite on the state.
And just to be absolutely clear about how ruthless this administration was, if you weren't family, your job security was basically non-existent. We have to look at the fate of his Grand Vizier, Haji Ibrahim Kalantar.
Yes, a hugely important man.
He was the kingmaker who essentially helped Aqqa Muhammad Khan unify the country. The sources say he actually told a British envoy at one point that his only real objective was to give his country one single king to stop the endless, bloody civil wars. He just wanted peace.
That was his goal.
And how is this loyal state builder rewarded by Fath Ali Shah?
He is executed, along with almost his entire extended family, in a sudden, brutal purge. In 1801, Fath Ali Shah ordered Haji Ibrahim arrested. He was thrown into a cauldron of boiling water.
Wait, boiling water?
Yes.
That is medieval. Why this sudden catastrophic violence against his top guy?
Fath Ali Shah ostensibly suspected him of treason, possibly colluding with a rebellious brother of the Shah. But more deeply, the execution was a brutal theatrical demonstration of absolute authoritarian control.
Because he was getting too powerful.
Exactly. Haji Ibrahim was too competent, too popular, and too deeply entrenched in the bureaucracy. Fath Ali Shah needed to prove that the state bureaucracy, the Divan, was entirely subservient to the monarch, not the other way around. It was a terrifying reminder to everyone in the kingdom that the king's power was absolute, reaching even the man who helped put his family on the throne.
Wow. Okay, so Fath Ali Shah is incredibly busy projecting this ancient, unshakable invincibility. He's building palaces, he's carving rocks, managing his 10,000 princes, and literally boiling his ministers to maintain control. But while he's looking inward, an entirely new, deeply modern threat is knocking on his doors.
The European empires.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the geopolitical meat grinder.
The map of threats completely shifts under the Qajars. For centuries, going back to the Safavids, Iran's primary threats were east-west. They fought the Ottoman Empire to the west in modern-day Iraq and Turkey, and they fought various Afghan or Uzbek confederations to the east.
Right.
But as the 19th century opens, that threat axis rotates 90 degrees, becomes north-south.
Yeah.
Russia is pushing relentlessly southward through the Caucasus, aiming for warm water ports. And Britain is expanding its control over India to the south and east, creating an ever-expanding buffer zone to protect its colonial investments.
So Iran suddenly finds itself as a massive geographic speed bump between two empires that have global ambitions.
A speed bump is a good way to put it.
And the diplomatic whiplash Iran experiences during this period is just stunning. Let's look at Britain first. In 1800, the British send Captain John Malcolm on a massive diplomatic mission.
Right.
And the British objective is clear. They want to use Iran to distract the Afghans from invading India, and they want Iran to block any potential French advances toward India. But the cultural disconnect during this mission, I mean, it is both hilarious and deeply revealing of how these two worlds just fundamentally misunderstood each other.
Oh, it's a fascinating clash of worldviews. When Captain Malcolm arrives, the British delegation and the Iranian court officials spend an agonizing amount of time arguing over basic etiquette.
Like shoes.
Yes. The British are used to European diplomacy. The Iranians are operating on ancient court rituals. Should the British take off their hats in the presence of the Shah? Should they take off their boots? To a European, removing a hat is a sign of respect, but taking off boots is an undignified vulnerability.
Like you're not fully dressed.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
But to an Iranian, keeping boots on inside a carpeted room is incredibly insulting and unclean. They eventually reach this absurd compromise where the British can keep their hats on, but they must wear makeshift cloth covers over their boots to respect the Persian interior spaces.
Which is funny, but the real substantive disconnect isn't about shoes, right? It's about the gifts. Malcolm brings incredibly lavish gifts. We are talking about massive mirrors, fine broadcloth, pocket watches, and jewels that cost the British East India Company an absolute fortune.
Right, and the interpretation of those gifts is where everything breaks down. To the British mind, operating on capitalist colonial logic, this is a transactional bribe.
Sure, it's the cost of doing business.
Exactly. They're paying for a service, buying a strategic military alliance, but that is fundamentally not how the Persian court views the exchange.
How do they see it?
Fath Ali Shah receives these massive, expensive gifts and interprets them entirely through the lens of traditional imperial tribute. To him, this proves his own imperial might. He views the British not as equal partners buying an alliance, but as acknowledging his superiority, much like provincial governors sending tribute to the King of Kings.
Oh, man. So he genuinely believed his own propaganda.
He really did. He thought he was the center of the universe.
But the British aren't the only ones playing this diplomatic game. Napoleon Bonaparte is tearing across Europe, and he also wants a gateway to India to strike at the British. So the French send their own envoys, and in 1807, Iran signs the Treaty of Finkenstein with France.
A major turning point.
Yeah, Napoleon promises to help Iran modernize its army and, crucially, to help them get their territory back from Russia. French engineers and military officers actually show up in Iran. They start drilling troops. They start building foundries for cannons. It looks like a massive game-changing win for Iran.
It looks like salvation. Right up until Napoleon abruptly changes his mind based on the shifting sands of European politics.
The betrayal.
Just a brutal betrayal. Just 2 months after signing the treaty with Iran, Napoleon meets with the Russian Tsar on a raft in the middle of a river and signs the Treaty of Tilsit. In doing so, he effectively abandons his alliance with Iran to secure peace in Europe. The French military mission in Iran is aborted. The engineers pack up and leave.
They just dip.
They just leave. It's a deeply cynical betrayal that leaves Iran completely exposed, without modernized weapons, facing the full brunt of the Russian military machine.
And that Russian machine is devastating. We have to talk about the sheer horrific cost of these 2 rounds of war with Russia, because they end in the treaties of Golestan in 1813 and Torkamanchay in 1828. And the losses are staggering. It's not just a border dispute, it is a dismemberment of the country.
Truly. Iran loses 17 Caucasian Khanates. This includes the territories of modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and the Republic of Azerbaijan. Geographically and demographically, that is roughly 10% of Iran's territory and 10% of its population, just gone permanently. And this wasn't empty desert. This was highly prized, wealthy agricultural land and crucial trade corridors. But the territorial loss, as bad as it was, wasn't the worst part.
Wait, really? What could be worse than losing 10% of your country?
The Treaty of Torkamanchay imposed even more crushing, long-lasting conditions, primarily the war indemnity.
Right. Russia demanded 5 million tumans in gold as reparations for the war. And just to put that number in perspective for the listener, that was double the Iranian state's entire annual income. I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
It's astronomical.
Imagine a modern country having to hand over 2 full years of its entire GDP in solid gold. There is an image from the historical records of Qajar officials literally weighing out a mountain of gold on massive scales, hanging from the ceiling, packing it up into boxes to send by caravan to St. Petersburg. It completely bankrupts the country. The treasury is entirely empty.
And perhaps even more damaging than the immediate financial ruin were the capitulatory rights established in the Supplementary Commercial Treaty of Torkamanchay.
Okay, let's slow down here because I really want to make sure we understand this. What exactly are capitulatory rights, and how do they work day to day? Because that sounds like dry legal jargon, but the sources make it clear it destroyed the country.
It absolutely did. Capitulations are essentially extraterritorial privileges. Russia forced Iran to grant Russian merchants the status of most favored nation. Crucially, this fixed their import and export tariffs at a meager, uniform 5%.
So they basically don't pay taxes.
Basically.
Right.
Furthermore, Russian subjects living or trading in Iran were entirely exempted from Iranian laws.
Wait, what?
Yes. If a Russian merchant committed a crime or had a contract dispute with an Iranian, the local police or Islamic courts could not touch him. The dispute had to be settled by Russian diplomats at the consulate.
That is insane.
It fundamentally undermined Iranian sovereignty. It created a 2-tiered justice system where foreigners were functionally untouchable. And worse, it established a legal precedent that the British, the French, and other European powers would soon demand and receive for themselves.
It's just so humiliating. You are a sovereign citizen in your own country, and a foreign merchant can flout your laws and undercut your business, and there is absolutely nothing your government can do about it.
Nothing.
And the public rage over this absolute humiliation boils over in 1829 with the Gribaudoff affair.
Yes, a very dark chapter.
Alexander Gribaudoff is this incredibly arrogant Russian envoy sent to Tehran to enforce the treaty. He acts less like a diplomat and more like a conquering Roman general. He uses the treaty terms to demand that a former Qajar vizier hand over several Georgian women from his harem. Now, these women had ostensibly converted to Islam and were legally married within the Iranian system.
It was an incredible, almost suicidal provocation by Gribaudoff. In the cultural context of 19th-century Islamic Iran, taking women from a high-ranking Muslim harem violated every conceivable social, religious, and honor boundary. The people of Tehran were already seething over the loss of land and the crushing taxes required to pay the indemnity.
Right, it was a powder keg.
And this demand was the spark. A prominent local cleric, a mujtahid, issued a fatwa declaring it a religious duty to rescue the women. An angry, heavily armed mob formed in the bazaar and stormed the Russian embassy compound.
And it was a bloodbath. They massacred Gribaudoff and his entire 70-person diplomatic staff. They overwhelmed the Cossack guards, killed everyone they could find, and literally dragged Gribaudoff's body through the streets. Only one single Russian staff member managed to hide and survive.
The fallout is terrifying.
Right, because the Qajar state is absolutely panicked. They know this gives Russia the perfect excuse to invade again and just take Tehran. To prevent another devastating war, Abbas Mirza, the Crown Prince, has to send his own young son all the way to St. Petersburg bearing a massive diamond to grovel and personally apologize to the Tsar.
It's the ultimate humiliation for the King of Kings.
Now, here is a question I think anyone listening would be asking right now. The Qajars are getting crushed militarily, their economy is being held for ransom, their envoys are begging for forgiveness, yet they don't get colonized like India, they survive.
Is it fair to say Iran wasn't saved by its own military strength, but precisely because Britain and Russia found them more useful as a weak buffer than a conquered territory?
That is the essential cynical truth of Qajar survival. If either Britain or Russia outright conquered Iran and absorbed it into their empires, the two greatest military powers on Earth would suddenly share a massive, highly militarized, thousands of miles long border.
Which means constant friction. Exactly. Neither empire wanted that friction. It would almost certainly spark a global war. A weakened, deeply indebted, diplomatically pliant Iran served both of their interests perfectly. It kept the space between them unperturbed. They didn't need to conquer the land because they had already conquered the economy.
Wow. But while the state survives on the map, these military defeats deeply wounded the spiritual and psychological pride of the nation. The King of Kings had lost to the infidels. The state could no longer protect its borders or its economy. And when the state fails that spectacularly, it opens the door for an entirely different kind of power to rise internally to fill the void.
Yes.
Which brings us to the men in the mosques, the rise of the Usuli mujtahids.
To understand this massive societal shift, we have to look at the religious landscape. Following the fall of the Safavid Empire in the 18th century, the Shia clerical establishment, the ulama, found themselves adrift.
Because they lost their patrons.
Exactly. They no longer had a strong theocratic state backing them. They had to reinvent themselves and figure out how to maintain authority. And they did this through a quiet but absolutely revolutionary doctrinal victory within the seminaries. The Usuli school of thought triumphed over the more literalist Akbari school.
Okay, theological debates can get very dense very quickly. What does the victory of the Usuli school actually mean on the ground for a regular person trying to live their life in 19th century Iran?
It changed absolutely everything about daily religious life. The Usulis instituted a core concept called taqlid, which translates to emulation. They argued that everyday believers, merchants, farmers, even the Shah himself, were fundamentally not capable of interpreting the complexities of Islamic law on their own.
So they needed a guide.
More than a guide. Therefore, every single believer was religiously required to choose a qualified, living jurist, a mujtahid, and strictly follow their legal and moral rulings in every single aspect of life. You couldn't just read the Quran and decide what it meant. You had to defer to the expert.
So it's not just going to mosque on Friday to hear a sermon. It's submitting to a personal, living Supreme Court justice for your soul. Whatever he says is the law, period.
Period.
And these mujtahids gained immense financial independence through this system too, right? Because they aren't getting a paycheck from the Qajar government.
Absolutely. The doctrine of taqlid allowed the mujtahids to collect the khums directly from their followers. The khums is a 20% religious tax on a believer's expendable surplus income.
20%? That's massive.
It is. Because the Qajar state was perceived by the clergy as secular, worldly, and lacking the sacred descent of the old Safavid kings, the clergy argued the state had no right to collect this specific religious tax. They collected it directly. This immense flow of capital made the top mujtahids incredibly wealthy and, crucially, financially independent from the Qajar government. They didn't need the Shah's money, which meant they didn't have to obey the Shah's orders.
But we really have to look at what these clerics were actually focused on. The historical records point to a major defining text from this era called the Jawahir al-Kalam.
Yes.
It was written by a prominent cleric, and it was massive, 44 volumes long. But when you look at what is actually inside those thousands of pages, it is mind-boggling. It completely ignores public law. It ignores civil rights. It offers no framework for how government should run.
None.
Instead, it spends nearly half of its pages obsessing over extreme minutiae of ritual purity. Scatological cleansing, menstruation, the highly specific, proper handling of corpses.
Yes, the intellectual focus of the clerical establishment turned intensely inward toward micromanaging individual bodily behavior. The text prescribed harsh medieval punishments like beheadings, lashings, and stoning for moral transgressions like drinking alcohol, playing music, or sexual impropriety.
But no structural law.
Right. As you noted, it's been zero time trying to define the boundaries of state power, the social rights of the individual against tyranny, or how to build a modern economy.
Wait, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. You have a country that is being economically dismantled by Russia and Britain, and the greatest legal minds in the country are writing 44 volumes that ignore civil rights entirely and spend thousands of pages on highly improbable bizarre scenarios of bodily defilement.
It's quite the
It,
paradox.
it sounds less like a functioning legal code designed to help society and more like an intense academic game of what if, played by scholars trapped in a bubble just trying to out-pedant each other.
That is a very accurate, if harsh, critique of the madrasa culture of the time. Many historians note that a vast number of these intricate legal cases debated in the Jawahir were purely academic exercises. They had zero practical application to daily life. It was the scholastic acrobatics of the seminary environment, proving intellectual dominance.
Just flexing.
Exactly, intellectual flexing. However, we cannot dismiss it as merely academic, because when these clerics stepped out of the madrasa and into the city streets, they wielded terrifying real-world power based on this authority.
Right. And no one illustrates this real-world terror better than Syed Muhammad Baker Shafti in the city of Isfahan. This guy's story is wild. It's like a 19th-century gangster movie.
It really is.
He starts as a poor village boy. He survives his seminary studies by literally eating stale bread and scavenging rotten melons. But he's brilliant and ruthless, and he rises to become the first cleric ever to hold the exalted title Hujjat al-Islam, which means the proof of Islam.
And he didn't just study texts in a mosque. He became a ruthless real estate mogul. He leveraged his religious authority to amass an empire. He owned 40 caravansaries, 1,000 shops in the bazaar, and vast tracts of agricultural estates. He did this largely through highly aggressive money lending.
Which explicitly violates the strict Islamic ban on usury. How does the proof of Islam get away with being a loan shark?
He used a legally dubious workaround. He would lend money, and the moment a merchant or peasant defaulted on a single payment, Shafti would use his religious authority to immediately seize the collateral, usually their land or shop, and at a fraction of its value. And his power wasn't just financial. Because the Qajar state apparatus was weak in the provinces, Shafti essentially ran his own parallel justice system in Isfahan. The historical records indicate he personally ordered, and sometimes personally carried out, executions of offenders based on his interpretation of the law.
Personally carried them out.
Yes. In one infamous instance, he ordered the beheading of a man accused of pederasty and then turned around and led the congregational prayers at the man's burial. He traveled through the city with an armed entourage of 2,000 people.
He sounds like a mafia don operating under the untouchable cloak of religion. How did the Qajar state, which we just said boiled its own ministers to maintain control, allow a guy like Shafti to run a parallel government in a major city?
Because it was an intricate, highly symbiotic dance of power. The Qajars, as we said, lacked sacred lineage. They were essentially tribal conquerors with nice new crowns. They desperately needed the top mujtahids to validate their rule to the deeply religious public, especially when declaring defensive jihad against the Russians.
So they made a deal.
An unspoken one, yes. In exchange for this validation, the state largely exempted the clergy from taxes, confirmed their massive land holdings, and turned a blind eye to their local power grabs. The clerics would occasionally incite a mob to protest a specific state policy, just to flex their muscles and keep the state in check, but they never fundamentally challenged the legitimacy of the Shah's right to the throne. They were partners in power, dividing the physical and spiritual realms between them.
But while the Qajar state and these incredibly wealthy, untouchable clerics are playing high-stakes games of power, land acquisition, and theological hair-splitting, the everyday people of Iran are facing an absolute apocalyptic reality on the ground.
It was grim.
The state is bankrupt, the clergy is hoarding wealth, and disaster is striking. Which brings us to the most harrowing part of our deep dive, the invisible enemies.
And we are talking about literal devastation that altered the demographic makeup of the country. We mentioned the expanding global trade routes earlier, steamships coming from British India up the Persian Gulf, caravans coming down from Russia. These routes brought more than just broadcloth and tea. They brought pandemics. Disease, cholera, plague, and smallpox began to ravage the Iranian population with terrifying speed and frequency.
I really want to pause and reflect on the gravity of this, because it's easy to just read statistics and move on. The numbers are hard to wrap your head around. There was an 1820 cholera outbreak in the southern city of Shiraz. The records show it wiped out 75% of the city's population in just 4 weeks.
75%.
Think about what that actually means. You walk out your front door, and 3 out of every 4 people you know, your family, your neighbors, the baker, the merchant, are dead in a month. Overall, historians estimate that out of a total population of about 8 million people in Iran at the time, 1 million died from these rolling pandemics over the century.
It is a level of trauma that permeates the entire society. And we have to remember, This is before the discovery of germ theory. These outbreaks were entirely mysterious. They were seen as noxious air, or more commonly, as direct acts of divine punishment for the sins of the community.
Which plays right into the hands of the clergy.
Exactly. But the tragedy was also heavily, brutally class-based. When cholera struck a city, the Qajar elite, the royal princes, and the wealthy merchants could simply pack up and flee to their isolated, breezy country estates in the mountains. The urban poor and the peasantry were trapped in the cramped, unsanitary cities and were decimated.
And if the diseases didn't kill you, the economic collapse would starve you. We mentioned those capitulatory treaties earlier, where Britain and Russia forced Iran to cap import tariffs at 5%. Let's look at how that actually destroys the local economy.
The miracle of the European Industrial Revolution was an absolute nightmare for Iranian artisans. Take the textile industry, which was the backbone of many Iranian cities. British factories in Manchester were producing miles of chintz and calico fabric using steam-powered looms.
Mass production.
Yes, they could produce it incredibly fast and incredibly cheap. They flooded the Iranian markets with this fabric. Now imagine you are a local Iranian weaver. You are using a manual hand loom. It takes you a week to weave what a machine makes in an hour.
You can't compete.
Mathematically, you simply cannot compete with the factory prices. And because your government is legally bound by the treaty to keep tariffs at 5%, they cannot protect you by taxing the foreign goods. The city of Kashan, which was world famous for its beautiful textiles, went from having 8,000 active, prosperous silk looms to just 800 by 1850. An entire middle class of artisans was eradicated.
And it wasn't just urban manufacturing, it was rural agriculture too. The ancient, highly lucrative silk industry in Gilan province up near the Caspian Sea was completely destroyed by a microscopic bug. The Phylloxera pest, which actually came over from the Americas via Europe.
It wiped out their crop.
To make up for this massive, sudden loss in export revenue, the wealthy merchants who owned the land started pushing the peasants to grow different cash crops for export to Europe and China. Specifically, they forced the shift to cultivating opium and tobacco. But here is the cruel logic of agricultural economics. You cannot eat opium.
Right.
By forcing vast tracts of agricultural land to shift from cultivating wheat, barley, and essential grains to growing cash crops for foreign markets, they created severe, chronic food shortages locally. This shift led directly to localized starvation and, combined with droughts, horrific famines. The land was producing wealth, but the wealth was going to the export merchants while the people working the land starved.
Add hyperinflation to all of this misery. Because Iran is importing so much cheap European fabric and exporting so little of value besides raw opium, all of their hard currency, their silver and gold, is draining out of the country to pay the trade deficits and the Russian war indemnities.
Yeah.
The national currency, the tumen, lost roughly 80% of its value over the century. And because hard money was so incredibly scarce, interest rates in the bazaar shot up to 25, sometimes 40%. The gap between the wealthy elite who profited from the import trade and government corruption and the starving populace became an unbridgeable chasm.
A total collapse of the social contract.
The tax burden fell entirely on the poor. In many regions, peasants were abandoning their ancestral villages entirely, fleeing into the mountains just to escape the brutal government tax collectors who were demanding money they didn't have.
So let's synthesize this. Put yourself in the shoes of an everyday person living through this. Imagine 10% of your country dying from horrific, inexplicable diseases. Your local industry and your livelihood are obliterated by cheap foreign imports. Your local food supply is replaced by opium fields. Your money is completely worthless.
It's unbearable.
And the religious leaders, who are supposed to be your spiritual protectors, are busy getting rich off land seizures and debating the esoteric rules of ritual purity. Wouldn't a society under that much relentless, multi-layered pressure inevitably snap?
It absolutely snaps. Historically, when a state entirely fails to protect its people physically or economically, and the orthodox religious establishment is too entrenched in the power structure to offer any real spiritual or material relief, the population doesn't just give up. They look for a radical alternative. They look for a savior.
And that alternative arrives like a lightning bolt in the middle of the century. Out of this extreme desperation, disease, and political failure arises a radical movement that challenges the very foundations of the state and Orthodox Islam itself, the Babi movement.
To understand why the Babi movement resonated so deeply, we have to briefly look at the spiritual groundwork that had been laid over the previous decades by groups like the Nematollah Lufis and, more importantly, the Shaikhi school of theology. The Sheki school was founded by a brilliant, controversial scholar named Usuli. He introduced this highly mystical concept called the Horkolya.
Okay, let's ELI5 that. What is the Holkolya?
In Orthodox Shiism, there is a belief in the hidden imam, the Mahdi, who went into hiding centuries ago and will physically return at the end of days to bring justice. It's a very literal, physical belief. Asai argued against this literalism.
No, so.
He said the hidden imam doesn't exist in a cave somewhere on Earth. Instead, he exists in the Horkolya, an intermediary celestial realm of archetypes and spiritual reality. To reach the imam, you don't wait for a physical return, you elevate your own spiritual consciousness. This completely moved the idea of salvation away from the strict, literalist, rigid interpretations of the Usuli clerics and opened the door for a more metaphorical, dynamic, and personal understanding of divine revelation.
And the timing of this theological shift is absolutely crucial. The year 1844 corresponds to the year 1260 in the Islamic calendar. That is exactly 1,000 years since the Shii hidden imam supposedly went into occultation.
A very heavy year.
The air across Iran is thick with millennial apocalyptic anticipation. People are looking at the plagues and the famines and thinking, this is it, the end of the world is here. And in that highly charged atmosphere, a young, charismatic merchant in the city of Shiraz named Sayyid Ali Muhammad stands up and proclaims that he is the Bab, which means the gate. He claims he is the direct gateway to the hidden imam.
And he doesn't stop there. As his movement gains traction, his claims escalate. He eventually proclaims that he is the return of the Mahdi himself, and ultimately he declares that he is a brand new manifestation of God, bringing an entirely new divine revelation.
Which is huge.
And the most dangerous part of this claim, he explicitly abrogates or cancels out Islamic Sharia law, says the era of Islam is over and a new era has begun.
This message spreads like wildfire. And look at who is converting to this movement. It's not the elite. It's the artisans whose looms were destroyed. The lower-ranking clergy who are locked out of the massive wealth of the top mujtahids, small-time merchants, and significantly, women. These are the exact groups who have been crushed by the economic collapse and completely alienated by the corrupt, wealthy Usuli clerics.
The Babi movement offered them a profound philosophical and societal shift. The Bab introduced a concept we can call cyclical progression. He argued against the orthodox idea that Islam was the final, perfect, unchangeable religion until the end of time.
Instead, he used seasons.
Exactly. He used the analogy of seasons. A divine revelation is like a tree. It blossoms in the spring with a new prophet. It bears fruit in the summer. It slowly dies and becomes rigid in the winter. And then, crucially, it is reborn with a brand new prophet in the next spring.
It's a beautiful metaphor, but in the context of 19th-century Islamic law, it's deeply subversive.
Utterly subversive. Because it implies that no religion, not even Islam, is the final, ultimate truth forever. It replaces the rigid, regressive worldview of the Orthodox clergy who believed all perfection was in the past, and society should just try to copy the 7th century with a forward-looking perspective. It empowered human agency. It said that society is meant to evolve. In its own esoteric, highly mystical way, the Babi movement was an indigenous Iranian attempt at modernity. It was a way of breaking the old system without having to copy the British or the Russians.
And he actually creates a parallel universe for his followers to live in. The Bab institutes a new 19-month solar calendar based entirely on numerology. Why does that matter? Because by abandoning the Islamic lunar calendar, he is severing his followers' ties to the rhythm of Islamic life, the fasting of Ramadan, the mourning of Muharram. He is building a new society from the ground up.
And it wasn't just theological theory.
No, it translated into shocking, highly visible public action. We have to talk about Tahera.
Taheri is one of the most remarkable figures of the 19th century. She was a brilliant poet and a highly educated scholar from a family of very prominent Orthodox clerics in Qazvin, but she converts to Babism and becomes one of its leading, most radical figures.
Yeah.
And the defining moment comes at a major gathering of Babi leaders in the remote village of Badasht in 1848. They are debating the future of the movement. Taheri stands up to give a speech, and she removes her facial veil.
I want the listener to really grasp the magnitude of this. In the context of 19th century, highly traditional Islamic Iran, an urban aristocratic woman intentionally removing her veil in a public gathering of men was an act of staggering defiance. It's hard to overstate the shockwave. It wasn't just a minor breach of etiquette. It was a symbolic shattering of one of the most sacred, visible Islamic mores. One of the men present was so horrified he reportedly slit his own throat on the spot.
It was that intense.
By showing her face, she was visually and undeniably declaring that the old laws of the Sharia were dead and a new radical era had begun.
It was a societal earthquake. But this level of radicalism, this complete rejection of the established order, terrified the establishment. The clerics and the Qajar state, who normally bickered over power, immediately joined forces to mercilessly crush the Abbas. They viewed it as a virus that had to be eradicated.
The state begins arresting and executing Abbas, which forces the movement into defensive armed insurrections. The most famous is at the fortress of Tabarsi in the north, where a few hundred poorly armed Abbas, including scholars and students, held off massive government armies for months before finally being starved out, promised safe conduct, and then treacherously massacred.
Just brutal.
In 1850, the Qajar government brings the Bab himself to the city of Tabriz and executes him publicly by a firing squad in the barracks square. And the violence only escalates. 2 years later, a rogue group of babies attempt to assassinate the Shah. They fail, and the state launches a horrific medieval bloodbath of reprisals in Tehran. Babies are blown from cannons, hacked to pieces in the streets, and Tahera, who was under house arrest, is secretly taken to a garden, suffocated with a silk scarf by a drunken guard, and thrown down a dry well.
It's a deeply tragic, brutal end to the first phase of this movement.
But I have a question about why it failed. Did the movement fail simply because it was outgunned and violently crushed by the state military? Or was it because its highly mystical, apocalyptic language, like having a calendar based on the number 19, couldn't actually translate into a practical, functioning blueprint for a modern state?
Yeah.
How do you run an economy on numerology?
It is almost certainly a combination of both. You cannot discount the sheer, overwhelming military force and state terror brought against them. But it's true that the Bab's language of prophecy, while carrying the essential kernel of societal renewal, was heavily steeped in esoteric Shaikh symbolism. It didn't offer a pragmatic constitution or an economic policy to replace the one failing them.
Right, it was spiritual.
However, what is deeply fascinating is the Bab's attitude toward the West. In his writings, he praised European postal systems, their printing presses, and their civic cleanliness. He saw the utility in their advancements, but he strictly banned foreign commercial penetration if it didn't bring useful, equitable trade. It perfectly highlights Iran's deep ambivalence during this century. They were desperate for Western technology and efficiency, but terrified of Western political and economic domination.
And that desperate need for efficiency perfectly sets up our final chapter. With the country literally fracturing from religious civil wars, a collapsed economy, and foreign empires actively carving up the borders, the Qajar state realized it had to reform from the inside or it was going to die. Which brings us to the desperate push for order and a man named Amir Kabir.
Mirza Taqi Khan, known to history as Amir Kabir, represents a completely different approach to modernity than the Babis. If the Babi movement was a grassroots, spiritual, bottom-up attempt at reform, Amir Kabir was the ultimate embodiment of pragmatic, state-enforced, top-down modernization.
He was a self-made man, right?
Entirely. He was a man of incredibly humble origins. He was the son of a royal cook. In a society obsessed with aristocratic lineage, he rose through the bureaucracy through sheer, undeniable competence. He became the tutor to the Crown Prince. And when that prince became Nasir al-Din Shah in 1848, Amir Kabir became his all-powerful chief minister.
And Amir Kabir hits the ground running. He looks at the chaos and decides the country needs Nazm, which means order. He looks at figures like Peter the Great in Russia or the Tanzimat reformers in the Ottoman Empire as his models. His first target is the military, because without an army, you have no state. He realizes the old tribal levies with swords and muskets can't fight the Russians. So he founds the Dar al-Fanun, the Abode of Skills, in 1851. This is Iran's first centralized Western-style polytechnic academy.
But notice the calculated genius in how he sets it up. He needs European instructors to teach the Iranian cadets engineering, modern medicine, geology, and artillery. But he explicitly refuses to hire British or Russian instructors because he knows they come with hidden imperial agendas and spies.
Smart.
Instead, he hires Austrian, Italian, and French officers. He recognizes the absolute need for Western science, but he tries to deliberately insulate it from Western political control.
He also realizes that you can't just change the army. You have to change how the elite think. You have to break the monopoly of the clerics on information. So he launches a government-run newspaper, the Vakhe-Etefakiyeh. Suddenly, literate Iranians aren't just reading medieval religious texts. They are reading articles about world geography, recent technological inventions like the telegraph, and even reports on the political structure of the American Republic.
And economically, he was a fierce nationalist. He championed domestic manufacturing to stop the bleeding of silver out of the country. He expanded the Tehran Bazaar, encouraged the building of local factories, and ordered that army uniforms be made exclusively of Iranian cloth, not British imports.
A full economic overhaul.
But to fund his military academies and his reforms, he had to balance the budget. And the Qajar state, as we know, was completely bankrupt. So he enforces a brutal, sweeping austerity regime across the government. He slashes the bloated pensions of the Qajar nobility, he fires corrupt courtiers, and he drastically cuts the allowances of the royal family itself.
It's like he's a turnaround CEO brought in by a desperate corporate board to save a dying company. His strategy is entirely sound. Build a tech academy, start a newspaper, audit the books, cut the waste. But the fatal mistake he makes is cutting the corporate expense accounts of the exact board members who hired him. He forgot that in this era, competence doesn't protect you if you threaten the elite's wallet. It's incredibly brave, but politically, it's a death sentence.
It was a fatal miscalculation of the entrenched power dynamics of the Qajar court. By attacking the financial privileges of the elite to save the state, he made incredibly powerful, vindictive enemies. The traditional government accountants, the Mostofis, hated him because his audits threatened their corrupt monopolies over local tax collection.
Of course they did.
The foreign embassies hated him because he refused to be bribed. And most dangerously of all, the young Shah's own mother, Maud Olia, deeply resented Amir Kabir's total control over her son and her purse strings. Within a few short years of intense reform, this coalition of elite interests works constantly to poison the young Shah's mind against his minister.
It's so tragic.
They convince the Shah that Amir Kabir is plotting to take the throne. The Shah dismisses him, exiles him to a garden in Tishan, and eventually, while drunk, signs his death warrant. Amir Kabir is murdered in the bathhouse, his veins opened by royal assassins.
And with his blood draining out on the bathhouse floor, the best, most pragmatic chance for a strong, modernized, independent Iranian state is washed away.
It really is.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this incredible century. When we pull back and look at the whole picture, from Fath Ali Shah carving rocks and executing viziers, to the horrific loss of the Caucasus, the decimation of cholera, the radical unveiling of Tahara, and the tragic murder of Amir Kabir, the survival of Qajar Iran is a breathtaking, terrifying balancing act. Yes, they lost territory. Yes, they suffered horrific plagues and economic devastation. They fought brutal internal ideological wars. But unlike India, unlike so many of their neighbors in Central Asia or Africa, they avoided total colonial subjugation. They maintained a distinct, continuous cultural voice. They adapted Western military and educational ideas, but they stubbornly tried to do it on their own terms, navigating the impossibly narrow space between two empires.
If we connect this century of survival to the bigger picture of history, we have to look at the psychological legacy of this era. We see how the Babi movement was mercilessly crushed and driven underground. We see how Amir Kabir's pragmatic, state-saving reforms were destroyed by massive, selfish elite resistance. But think about the everyday people who lived through this meat grinder.
The weavers in Kashan who were driven to bankruptcy by British textile dumping.
Exactly. The peasants who abandoned their ancestral farms and fled into the hills to escape corrupt, violent tax collectors. The secret dissidents reading forbidden texts, keeping the memory of Tahara and the Bab alive in the shadows. The intellectuals reading the new gazettes. As the 19th century closed, the trauma of these events didn't just vanish into the history books. It simmered. I want to leave the listener with this final thought. Consider how this very specific toxic combination of an untouchable, incredibly wealthy religious class, a financially compromised, corrupt state that sold its economy to foreigners, and a populace desperately hungry for the rule of law and social justice might be the exact recipe for the massive, explosive constitutional revolution that would erupt across Iran at the dawn of the 20th century. The house didn't collapse in the 19th century, but the people inside were finally getting ready to tear down the walls themselves.
That is an incredible, chilling thought to end on. You look at that crumbling, sprawling mansion we talked about at the very beginning. The roof is caved in, the paint is peeling, the pressure from the outside empires is immense. But because of the deep trauma, stubborn resilience, and the relentless search for a new way forward, the people inside aren't just surviving the rot. They are quietly gathering the tools, the ideas, and the rage to eventually tear down the old walls and build something entirely new. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Qajar era. We hope it gives you a vibrant new lens to view this incredible history. Keep questioning the past, and we'll see you next time.